trying to understand the world that we live in and how we're connected to it. So we can only do it by connecting these two spheres, right? We can't keep them separate. So once we open ourselves up to these many possibilities, he thinks this is what it means to be impartial, right, in contemplation. And he says that this is going to be the very same quality, right, this desire for truth, which when we act will be just, when we emote, when we have feelings, will result in universal love, which can be given to all, and not only those who are judged useful or admirable, right? Surely we don't want to only be valuable insofar as people can get something from us, right? That we value things in and of themselves, right? Thus, again, this contemplation enlarges not only the objects of our thought, but also the objects of our actions and affections. And this is my favorite line of the whole chapter. He says, it makes us citizens of the universe, not only of one walled city at war with the rest, right? So in a time when people are literally calling for building walls, right? He's talking about breaking down those barriers that have been built up, really by others, around your mind, right? And freeing that. He says, in this citizenship of the universe consists people's true freedom and their liberation from the thraldom of narrow hopes and fears. Philosophy, thus, is to be studied for the sake of the questions themselves, because these questions enlarge our conception of what is possible, enrich our intellectual imagination, and diminish the dogmatic assurance which closes the mind against speculation, right? So people who think they have everything figured out are often not interested in asking these questions, okay? So this is even maybe a good life lesson, right? If you are in a situation where you are not able to answer questions, or someone is not willing or open to questions, that should be a red flag, right? We need to be able to reason through things, and we can only do that with information. All right, so in the next few slides, I mostly just have sort of an overview of what we just talked about, right? And so the next bit is just clarifying those different areas of philosophy. So there's a little bit more here. Little note on the last couple, axiology is the study of valuing. So this includes both aesthetic values, right, for art and beauty, as I mentioned earlier, and moral values. When we study moral values specifically, this area of axiology is called ethics, and we can do normative or descriptive ethics. So normative activities are where we talk about what ought to be the case, and descriptive activities are where we talk about the way things actually are. All right, and so the last bit of this is just really to go over some of the few basics of argumentation, right? So most of this should be picked up from the reading, so I'm going to kind of skip over most of the terminology and focus on some specifics. Okay, so let's clarify the difference between an argument and an explanation. So an argument, very quickly, again, is reasons for thinking that something is the case, right? So that would be different from telling us why or how something is the case. So for example, if I were to explain a rainbow, right, I would tell you why, right, certain particles, or how certain particles, right, of moisture in the atmosphere refract light, right, and talk about the color spectrum and all that stuff, right? That's an explanation. That's different from giving you an argument, which would be giving you a reason for thinking that there is a rainbow, or that there is not a rainbow, right, or that that rainbow was created by leprechauns, right? So it's a reason for getting you to believe something, as opposed to an explanation. All right, and so arguments can be, you can make arguments about all kinds of things, but the arguments that we're going to be concerned about in philosophy are going to be those that involve statements which are either true or false, and ones that are not both. So an opinion would be an example of something that can be both true and false, right? So I can think that chocolate is the best flavor ice cream, you can think it's not. Neither of us is right or wrong, right? But if we say that the earth is flat, we can disagree, but we can't both be right. Okay, so we're dealing with arguments that have that sort of objective truth value, right? And so arguments in philosophy are going to be composed of two types of statements: premises, or at least one premise, and a conclusion. And then there are going to be different types of arguments. Inductive arguments, which are really about likelihood or probability, and we assess those using terms like strength and weakness, right? A strong argument, right, strong inductive argument, means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is more likely to be true. Then, if we find out we have a strong inductive argument, we can then check to see if the premises of that argument are true in the world. And I'll clarify more on that in a little bit, right? But the big thing here is that we don't check for the actual truth of the premises until the end. And if it turns out we have a strong inductive argument with true premises, that is called a cogent argument. Deductive arguments, on the other hand, are not meant to deal with likelihood or probability. They're trying to instead establish the truth of the conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt, right? So they're trying to prove it. Now, in this case, in order to judge its success, we would use terms like valid or invalid, since the truth-preserving nature of deductive arguments really has to do with the structure, so we have different terminology. So valid arguments do not have to do with the actual truth of the premises. If you recall, I said that comes later. Validity just says that if the premises were true, right, then the conclusion must also be true. So if it's the case that if the premises are true but the conclusion could still be false, then you're dealing with an invalid argument, right? And there are some examples and further explanations in the reading. And again, after we determine whether an argument is valid or invalid or strong or weak, right, the success, then we can check and see if the premises are true. So in deductive terms, if we have a deductively valid argument and it turns out all the premises are true, then that argument is sound. Okay,